Michael Burry put out a tweet, and this tweet is a bit crazy. It's pretty interesting. It's a bit crazier than me going from beard to no beard, but it is a tweet that has some crazy predictions, which is why I think it's crazy. I've said the word crazy many times because it's kind of crazy. Michael Burry, this is his tweet. Inflation peaked 9.1% in June, but it is not the last peak of this cycle. We are likely to see CPI lower, possibly negative, in second half of 2023. He just called for a negative inflation reading in the second half of 2023. That's only 6 months away, by the way, less than 6 months now. And the U.S. in recession by any definition. So he agrees the U.S. will be in recession. The Fed will cut and government will stimulate, meaning the Fed will cut interest rates and the government will stimulate, whether that's through quantitative easing or sending out checks, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we will have another inflation spike. It's not hard. This tweet got 4 million views. We know how many views it gets now because Twitter has unleashed this view feature, which is a really good feature. But I mean, this is a very interesting tweet. So basically his argument is that inflation at 9% in June, the reason the markets rallied in June because inflation was at 9%. Well, why did the markets rally if inflation is at 9%? Because we know that it's not going to get more than 9%. So if we know that inflation is at 9% and that the market's not going to go, or that inflation is not going to go higher than that, the market's forward looking, bakes that in, goes up. Then inflation went down to 7.1%, which was not bad over the past couple months, going from 9.1 to 7.1. Obviously, the markets haven't totally collapsed. S&P down 58%. It's only down 20%. Obviously, markets didn't go super high up with the Santa Claus rally that we thought we would get. So the market stayed relatively flat, went down a little bit, but wasn't the end of the world. Nonetheless, inflation is still 7.1%. And most optimistic projections say that inflation can be down to about 4% by the end of the year. Michael Burry just said negative second half of 2023. That means that inflation will go down from 7.1% right now down to a reading that is so negative that we are in a deflationary cycle. So it's a little bit of the Cathie Woods camp. And the question I've been asking myself is, why does Michael Burry think this will happen? Because as many catalysts as there might be for inflation to start going down because it has peaked, the idea that we will get negative, that means full deflation 2023, to me is a bit absurd. I don't see that personally happening. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, if you're 200 pounds to get to 150 pounds, it's a lot easier than to go from 150 pounds to 100 pounds. 9.1 to 7.1 was relatively easy. Like, we were able to get there. To keep that growth rate up in terms of a month-over-month decline, I don't think is going to be that easy, given the geopolitical crisis we have, given the energy crisis we have, given the fact that housing hasn't even been factored into a lot of these inflation readings. There are so many different externalities and catalysts that exist that could make inflation not go down as much as Michael Burry thinks it's going to go down. So the idea that it's going to go negative in second half of 2023, look, I might be wrong, but my prediction is that's not going to happen. I do not believe we will have a negative inflation reading in the second half of 2023. Do I think it can get low? Yeah. Do I think it's going to go negative? No. Then he says the U.S. is in recession. Agree with that. But the Fed will cut and government will stimulate. I do not think we will have to cut interest rates to such an extent that stimulation in the context of economic stimulus is going to happen. I think like maybe we cut interest rates to some extent. Chair Powell has said basically by 2025, we're going to cut very slightly or it's going to stay flat. So if you imagine the next couple years of interest rates being where they're at right now or even higher, maybe slightly below where they are, you imagine an economy that's relatively stable, if not in a recession, but definitely not an economy that's going to the moon. If the Fed cuts interest rates dramatically, which they will have to do if we're in a deflationary cycle, if interest rates are negative, if inflation is negative, we have to stimulate the economy somehow, and the best way to do it is to decrease interest rates. To imagine that's going to happen at such a dramatic level and that the government will then stimulate, meaning quantitative easing, right? That's punting money into the economy. Right now, we're buying a lot of bonds and money and equities off the economy. So, or not equities, bonds primarily. We're selling them off. In a quantitative easing, you start buying them. So you start putting a bunch of money into stocks, into bond market. You start buying different things up. Stocks tend to go a little bit higher. So investors stop investing in bonds because the risk-adjusted rate of return is way higher on stocks than bonds, whereas right now it's higher if you get 4% of your money on the 10-year versus not having to take any risk. Then people invest in bonds, which means they sell off stocks. If we start stimulating again and we do quantitative easing, which is we start buying all this stuff, versus quantitative tightening, which is we take them off of our balance sheets, which is what the Fed is doing right now, that will stimulate the economy. Another form of stimulus could potentially be sending out checks. Now, I don't think that's going to happen because I think most Americans have realized that after getting those checks, what happened with inflation is probably not the best thing. And we probably don't want more checks if it's going to lead to a more bigger inflationary cycle with the Fed just printing money. So it's hard to imagine that inflation goes down negative, and then after inflation goes down negative in an election year, the government somehow, which the House controlled by the Republicans now, agrees with the Democrats in the Senate to pass massive forms of stimulus and cut interest rates dramatically. Would the Congress and the Democrats and the Republicans be excited to do this? Yes, because that means probably a better economy in the short term, and that's obviously good for voters. Now, granted, I don't think the Republicans would be, because they don't want to give Biden a big win as he's going into an election year. But it's hard to think that inflation would actually get that low. Let's take a look at the side that agrees with Michael Burry about why inflation potentially could come down because of supply side issues.
Morning to both of you. David, how persistent do you think inflation is going to be? And take us inside the mind, if you could, of Jay Powell and how you think he's thinking about it.
I think inflation is going to be coming down because a lot of the supply side problems are easing. The price of shipping a container across the Pacific has come down. Used car prices have fallen for 5 months in a row. Housing prices are beginning to soften. But I don't think it's going to come down fast enough for Jay Powell to relax. I think Jay Powell very much wants to avoid being seen as the Fed chair who let inflation get out of the bottle. He doesn't want to be the guy who undid all the progress that has been made since Paul Volcker's years. So I suspect, they pretty much have baked in another 75 basis points, and I suspect they'll go higher because I think he wants to err on the side of doing too much rather than too little.
Joel, what do you think?
Well, I think that throughout all of this, it's unfortunate that the chair of the Fed, Chair Powell, has not accepted responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in. Were it not for the Fed printing trillions of dollars to fund the explosive growth in federal spending under both Presidents Trump and President Biden, we would not be having the inflation that we're experiencing today. And even if those inflation rates ease off of those 40-year highs that we saw last year and come back down to, say, 4 or 5%, that does nothing to relieve the pain of the middle class that now have seen their real wages decline by more than $6,000 over the past 2 years.
David, do you think that he needs to take more responsibility? And what does that mean?
I think he's actually been, by Fed chair standards, fairly candid. When he spoke at Brookings a few weeks ago, he said flatly, we made a mistake. We should not have said that we would keep interest rates low despite falling unemployment until inflation started to pick up. So, yeah, I mean, the guy hasn't exactly gone out there and flagellated himself, but compared to, say, Alan Greenspan, who I think admitted one mistake in 20 years as Fed chair, I think he's done that. I agree, though, that when we do the anatomy of what went wrong here, that the Fed was slow. They didn't react when fiscal spending was a lot more than they had anticipated. And I think that's going to be a factor now. I suspect the last burst of federal spending, the stuff that recently passed, will add another 0.25 percentage point to the Fed's terminal rate.
Joel, you satisfied with that response?
Oh, I know, because if you go back over the past 2.5 years, it was the Federal Reserve coordinating very closely with Congress, with President Trump, and with President Biden to ensure that the explosive growth in spending on the federal level would be financed by the Federal Reserve, printing trillions of dollars to purchase government bonds, and of course to also inflate the housing market by purchasing trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities. The primary issue here is not that the Federal Reserve has reacted too slowly by raising interest rates, it's that they actually worked hand in hand with Congress in a disastrous manner that ensured that we would have this huge burst of inflation that we experienced in 2022. This was forecast by many, not just free market economists, but also by President Obama's former top economist, Larry Sumner. So for the Fed to refuse to acknowledge their role in this because of all the money printing, that is a travesty.
And I mean, I think that's the biggest issue, obviously, with what's been going on with the Fed, is that they have not acknowledged that they played a massive role in allowing all of this to happen. And as a result, this is why we are in this particular crisis, right? Jerome Powell said inflation was transitory for months before finally agreeing that it might not be transitory. Now, the larger issue here is Michael Burry right? Personally, I do not think he's right. I do not think we get inflation that low by the end of the year. If that happens, I'll be very shocked. I think it can go down to something as low as 3%, but to imagine it declines that precipitously, it means that something is wrong completely in the way that we're analyzing right now, that might be the case. But remember, then Burry says, if it goes down, the government stimulates, and then we get inflation again, which means he's imagining we have a market downturn, market up because inflation goes down, and then boom, market goes back down because inflation peaks again. Is that all going to happen in the next couple years? I don't think so. Michael Burry is one of this guy that makes a trillion different predictions. I wouldn't agree with this analysis that he's put out there. I think it's lacking in a lot of nuance and a lot of analysis. Even if he's right about inflation going down, I do not think that leads to massive stimulus. I do not think that leads to then another inflationary peak because of that stimulus. And I do not think that happens all within the course of the next 18 months. I think it'll take time for inflation to go down. As it goes down over the next 18 months, the Fed will cut some interest rates. As that happens, the market will slowly start to recover, but that'll take time. And if it doesn't happen, we're in for a wild 2023. Thank you guys so much for listening and watching. Let me know your thoughts on this video. I'll see you guys in the next one.